I'll answer questions on his path. He's gone to Indonesia for the G20, Mr Speaker.
Questions without notice. Are there any questions? The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. More than 700 people have died of COVID in aged care this year alone, more than twice the number for the whole of last year. Tens of thousands of residents are not getting the care they deserve because of staff shortages. Aged care homes are closing and aged care workers and nurses are exhausted. Why won't the Prime Minister stop playing political games, do his job and fix this crisis?
The Minister for Health has the call. The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question. One of the most significant things which this government has done during the course of the pandemic is to focus on protections in aged care. As I said yesterday, we recognise that each loss in this pandemic is a tragic loss for those that are affected. We are, however, in the position where, thankfully, due to the work of our nurses and our carers and of all of those involved, we have one of the lowest rates of loss of life in residential aged care in the world, a rate which, when we look at the United Kingdom and the United States, is multiple times higher in those countries, and unfortunately many countries that have been affected during the pandemic were not able to count and chronicle all those whose lives were affected by COVID, and we, by contrast, have been able to ensure that we have not just been able to take care and treat, but to ensure that we have a comprehensive accounting of all of those that have sadly been lost. In particular, in terms of our actions, what we have done is lay down a series of things. Firstly, in relation to the PPE, this year, for example, we have provided over 50 million units of PPE within the aged care sector. That includes now over 14 million rapid antigen tests. That includes approaching 20 million masks, a similar number of gowns, significant numbers of goggles, practical action. That then comes on top of that which is being done in relation to boosters. We have an 86.4% rate.
Hotham.
Sorry, I apologise. An 86.6% rate of boosters amongst the eligible population, and a 92% rate of take-up for first doses amongst those. 100% of facilities across Australia have had first, second and third dose visits, with now well over 300 having had a fourth visit as a minimum so far. What all of that does is then combines with the work which has been put in place to help protect and support the workforce. And as part of that, we've been able to assist in their retention with, at this point in time, over $600 million provided through 4 retention bonus payments. These payments are about not just recognising and rewarding the workers rightly, but ensuring that there are incentives to enter and incentives to remain in the system. All of these actions, in the context of a global pandemic, have come together to ensure that Australia, whilst not untouched,
the Minister's
facing real
time
tragedy,
has expired. The member for Lindsay has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is delivering on its strong economic plan to secure our recovery?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Lindsay, who is seeing the strong resurgence of our economy, Mr Speaker, through the pandemic in Western Sydney in particular. Now, Mr Speaker, the risks to our economic and national security are of course increasing with the uncertainties we're seeing all around the world. I had the opportunity to speak to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, this morning, Mr Speaker, and this is one of the many issues that we discussed, in particular in relation to Ukraine. But, Mr Speaker, a strong economy means a stronger future for Australians. And as we've been coming through this pandemic with one of the strongest advanced economies in the world, Mr Speaker, that gives us great optimism for the year ahead. And, Mr Speaker, I welcome the decision made by the Premiers in New South Wales and in Victoria today, Mr Speaker, a further sign that Australia is pushing through and coming out the other side in relation to this pandemic. But, Mr Speaker, a strong economy as we come through this pandemic in the future depends on strong financial management, Mr Speaker, and a strong economic plan. Now, that strong financial management, Mr Speaker, has been demonstrated in Australia retaining our AAA credit rating, one of only 9 countries around the world from all the key ratings agencies to be able to maintain that strong record of financial management despite the incredible pressures of this pandemic. And our strong economic plan is delivering on the ground, a plan that is cutting taxes and lowering regulation and cutting red tape, Mr Speaker, to drive investment, a plan that is ensuring that we are investing in the infrastructure and the skills development that has seen, Mr Speaker, the highest level of trade apprentices and trade training today at 220,000 than at any other time since the Leader of the Opposition was born in 1963, Mr Speaker. We are working to deliver reliable, affordable energy despite the pressures, with sensible and balanced targets for emissions reduction and investing in a gas-fired recovery to keep electricity prices down. Our data and digital plan will see us become a top 10 digital and data economy by the year 2030, Mr Speaker, and our plan for sustainable and advanced manufacturing with sovereign capability, Mr Speaker, is delivering on the ground through our Modern Manufacturing Initiative. But today, 12,900 more jobs, Mr Speaker, in the month of January, the highest level of Australians of working-age employment in Australia's recorded history at 76.3%. Mr Speaker, unemployment rate for women has fallen to 4%. 4%, the lowest number since monthly records began in 1978. Under our government, there's 1 million more women in work than there was before we came to government. Mr Speaker, the unemployment rate is at 4.2% and it's heading to below 4%. And, Mr Speaker, youth unemployment is at 9%, a fall again, and that is down from 12.7% when those opposite last sat on the Treasury benches.
The Prime Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Eden-Monaro.
Is the Prime Minister aware that in Bombala, in my electorate, an aged care home has announced it will be forced to close? This on top of another closure in Eden in December last year. The aged care provider says it is not sustainable nor responsible to have existing staff working double shifts with no respite or reserves on standby. The Health Department says 6 other aged care facilities are in the process of closing their doors. When will the Prime Minister stop playing political games, do his job and fix this crisis?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, and I thank the member for Eden-Monaro for her question. I am aware of the facility in question, in particular the Currawanna Residential Aged Care Facility in Bombala, as well as the Tension Swansea Residential Aged Care Facility, both of which are operated by Southern Cross Care. At my request, the Department of Health is today meeting with the Council, with representatives of the state government and representatives of the community. They are examining options to deal with this particular facility. We have to date already provided $808,000 in the Business Improvement Fund to the Snowy Monaro Regional Council and an additional $80,000 to the Bombala Multi-Purpose Service for capital upgrades to improve that service. Whilst this is a particular decision of a particular provider, we have stepped in to intervene immediately. The other thing to note, though, and I want to respond specifically to the member's point, is that contrary to that which was set out, the number of new services opening over the last 5 years and in the last year has vastly outnumbered the number of closures. So there are facilities that open and facilities that close. There are 6 times as many homes that have opened over the last 5 years, 288 on the advice I have from the department, as opposed to those that have closed, 48. That is a very different position from that which was presented during the course of the question. The second thing is, even last year, during the course of the pandemic, during one of the most difficult and challenging years that facilities would have faced, in 2020 and 2021, in that financial year, almost 4 times as many homes opened as closed. There were 46 homes that opened new residential aged care facilities around Australia, and the advice I have is that there were 12 facilities that closed during the course of that time. What does that mean? That means that there are facilities in the natural course of events that will commence, and there are those facilities which will close and which will then ensure that those residents are placed in a care situation. That's what we're doing here. We recognise that these two facilities are of real importance to the community. That's why we've stepped in with the $808,000 to the Business Improvement Fund. That's also why we have stepped in with an absolute requirement that the facilities remain operating until each resident is taken care of. That is also why we have stepped in at my specific request with the very meeting which is occurring today involving the Health Department, the Council, the state government representatives and the community. And it is my hope that working together we'll be able to provide additional support for families, residents and an ongoing program of assistance.
The member for Groom has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please inform the House how strong economic management helps to create jobs and opportunity for Australians, and is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has it.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Groom because he understands that a strong economy is the basis for everything else that you hope to achieve as a government. It's a strong economy that guarantees the essentials that Australians rely on, whether that's the pension, Mr Speaker, whether that is aged care funding, Mr Speaker, at record levels under this government, whether it's the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It all depends on the economic and financial management that is necessary to ensure a strong economy, because a strong economy means a stronger future. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked about the uncertainty of the times and what is necessary. Now, Mr Speaker, what you need is strong economic leadership and strong leadership on national security. There needs to be strength in your decisions, and there is no room for weakness, Mr Speaker. And I have been asked about alternative approaches, and it is true I have answered the member for Lindsay about the government's strong economic plan. But, Mr Speaker, there is an alternative approach that we know that comes from the Labor Party, and in particular the Labor Party. Mr Speaker, it was the Shadow Treasurer who was asked by David Spears, Mr Speaker, would you increase taxes for ordinary Australians at all? His answer, would you increase it, he said, we haven't finalised our full suite of policies, as you'd appreciate, Mr Speaker. There are still 2 budget updates between now and the next election. Mr Speaker, there was a simple answer. No, we're not going to increase taxes. But, Mr Speaker, the Shadow Treasurer couldn't answer it that way, because we know the Labor Party and the Labor leader in particular, Mr Speaker, has always been for higher taxes, as the Treasurer has been reminding that House. He's been for a mining tax, he's been for a carbon tax, he's been for a congestion tax, he's been for a retirees tax, he's been for inheritance taxes, Mr Speaker. He had for inheritance taxes, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Relevance, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister was unable to sustain an answer about the government's actions for a minute.
No,
I mean, literally less than a minute.
Leader of the Opposition
well, Mr Speaker, if the question...
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister is in order.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There will be a choice made by Australians this year at the election, Mr Speaker, and they will be weighing up the choice. And economic management will be a key factor in that choice because of the uncertain times which we face. And this is a leader of the Labor Party who has supported higher taxes all his life, Mr Speaker. And to think he wouldn't do so when push comes to shove at the behest of the Melbourne and the Greens, Mr Speaker, is pure fantasy. The weak financial management, they would have spent $81 billion more during the pandemic from the very policies they enunciated during the time. Their climate policies, Mr Speaker, will only put electricity prices up because they don't strike the right balance. And small business will face a rejuvenated militant union movement, whether on the waterfront, Mr Speaker, or in the supply chain, choking up their supply chains. Mr Speaker, this is the Leader of the Opposition who wanted the government to buy an airline in the middle of the pandemic, but when he was Transport Minister, he couldn't even build an airport.
The Prime Minister's time has expired. Just before I call the member for Hotham, I just want to remind members of what Standing Order 65B says. And I'll read it out to you. It's very short. I won't detain the House very long. When a member is speaking, no member may converse aloud or make any noise or disturbance to interrupt the member. Now, it's pretty straightforward, really. I don't expect everyone to be silent, but the level of interjections is far too high. I'd ask members on all sides of the House to please keep it down. Member for Hotham has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Quality aged care needs a properly supported workforce. The aged care workforce is highly casualised and low paid. Why won't the Prime Minister support a permanent wage increase for these exhausted workers to help relieve critical workforce shortages affecting the care of vulnerable residents?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the member for the question. Soon after becoming Prime Minister, one of the first things I did was to call the Royal Commission into aged care. And, Mr Speaker, that Royal Commission was called, as the Minister for Health and Aged Care has reminded the House, and it followed the Oakden crisis, Mr Speaker. The state government-run aged care facility in South Australia, run by the former Labor government. And, Mr Speaker, that Royal Commission has highlighted so many important issues. And, Mr Speaker, when we received the response to that Royal Commission in last year's budget, we supported a detailed plan, Mr Speaker, to address the recommendations of the Royal Commission, totalling some more than $17 billion in investment to address the many issues in aged care. Now, no other government has done that before, Mr Speaker. No other government, other than the government that I have led, has been prepared to call a Royal Commission to this issue and then announce a record investment of over $17 billion, Mr Speaker, to address the many issues, including the ones which the member highlights when it comes to workforce, Mr Speaker. And the workforce issues—
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Hotham.
Speaker, on relevance, the question is about aged care, but it was very specifically targeted at the crucial question of aged care wages, and I wonder if the Prime Minister could go to that point, please.
Well,
aged care. The question is entirely about the crucial issue of the pay of aged care workers, and the Prime Minister is more than a minute in and has not touched on that topic at all.
I thank the member for Hotham for that clarification. The question did go to the quality of aged care and its workforce. So it wasn't just purely confined to the issue of wage increases. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And the Royal Commission did address issues of workforce, and in the more than $17 billion of response that we've provided to the Royal Commission, Mr Speaker, those recommendations do address that in the funding commitments that are in the budget, Mr Speaker. And on the particular issue the member raises, as she will know, that is actually for the Fair Work Commission. And I'm not aware, Mr Speaker, of a difference in policy that between the government and the opposition. Whatever the Fair Work Commission decides on this matter, Mr Speaker, then the government will support those arrangements, and we, as the opposition would. So I'm not quite sure, Mr Speaker, what is the difference that the member opposite is seeking to suggest here. The Fair Work Commission is addressing this issue. That's where it should be addressed, Mr Speaker, and we will work with the outcome that comes from that Fair Work Commission.
The Minister for Health has
the measures specifically which the government has undertaken in response to the Royal Commission with the over $17 billion of funding as part of the Respect, Care and Dignity National Plan include the growing a skilled and high-quality workforce for care for senior Australians, payment to registered nurses of $216 million over 7 years. In addition to that, $3.9 billion for mandatory care time standards, which is the payment for the average of 200 minutes per day of registered nursing staff. And in addition to that, we have engaged with the Fair Work Commission. I would note, however, that when the Leader of the Opposition was asked about the very question which was put to the Prime Minister, his response was It's up to the Fair Work Commission to determine what they want to do. Utter hypocrisy.
The member for Mayo has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Minister, in Senate estimates, the Department of Home Affairs confirmed that there were no security concerns with the asylum seekers currently detained in the Park Hotel. Why then is the government continuing to detain these people?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question and her very genuine interest in these matters. What I can say is that we have had to deal with the legacy of the Labor government, which has resulted in 50,000 people arriving on over 800 boats, 1,200 people tragically dying at sea. Now, because of that legacy, it has meant that it has taken us a considerable amount of time to deal with that legacy, and we are continuing to deal with it because that is a lot of people that were in held detention. 10,000, in fact, were in held detention as the legacy of Labor. Now, what we have committed to as a government is to work to make sure that as many of those people are resettled as we can possibly manage in the shortest possible amount of time. So we are working with the United States on the resettlement program so that as many people can transfer to the United States and be resettled as soon as possible. It's on the public record now that we are working with New Zealand to look at resettlement options so as many people as possible can resettle as soon as there is an arrangement that is in place. And I do thank the New Zealand government for the high level of cooperation that they have given. There are people who are in detention now who cannot be released into community detention for a number of reasons. Some of that is because of character grounds. Some of it is because of quite considerable health issues related to those individuals. But what I can assure the member for is that we are working to have those people resettled as soon as we possibly can, and we will continue to do that.
The member for Herbert has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. The Coalition Government is committed to supporting rural and regional communities, which remain a core strength of Australia's economy and identity. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House the government's support for regional economies, and are there any threats or uncertainty posed to their prosperity?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, and as always note his service to our nation and thank him for his service to our nation. But his service goes on, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I also thank him for his support of the Copper String project, which is so vitally important for our nation, and vitally important to make our nation as strong as possible, as quickly as possible. Now, Mr Speaker, it's also noted that many of our major exports, in fact, I would say 8 out of 10, come from regional Australia, whether it's iron ore, coal, gas, bauxite, gold, cattle, sheep. These things are incredibly important because it gives value to our currency, and value to our currency allows us to import products and get the terms of trade in place so that we can support our standard of living, which is vitally important. And if we lost those major exports, of course, they would have major inflationary effects on our imports and would affect our standard of living. Things would become more expensive and people would become poorer. That's why this side of the House believes so strongly that we maintain our standard of living by maintaining a strong balance of payments, a strong terms of trade through our exports. But we look on the other side, Mr Speaker, and I had a look, and Mark Butler says there's no room for gas. The member for High Marsh. The member for High Marsh says there's no room. They're interjecting very loudly.
The Deputy Prime Minister will use the correct names in the chamber.
Sir. The member for High Marsh says there's no room for gas. No room for gas in Australia's prosperity. No room for gas. That's going to make things rather difficult for us in the future, isn't it? The Deputy Leader of the Labor Party, and this is the best one, the Deputy Leader said the global market for thermal coal has collapsed, and at one level that's a good thing. Hear that, Central Queensland. Hear that, Hunter Valley. He thinks you losing your job is a good thing. That is going to be very interesting. I went back to the member for Hindmarsh and I just put in his name, which I can't mention, and coal. The first thing that comes up, 5 words. Labor, say no to coal. Say no to coal. So things aren't looking good for the Hunter Valley. They're not looking good for Central Queensland. And the reason is the Green Labor Alliance. Green and Labor Alliance. The Galahs over there are going to put at risk the people of Central Queensland. They are doing it at this very moment. They are in coalition in the ACT. We live in an area of a Green Labor Alliance. They were in coalition in Tasmania and they have been in coalition federally. We remember the wedding photo, the Prime Minister, the Greens and the Independents.
Order. When the interjections have ceased, I'll call the member for Corangamite. When the interjections have ceased. The member for Corangamite has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How can the government give $20 billion to businesses with rising earnings but not support a permanent pay increase to aged care workers, which would help address chronic work shortages?
The Prime Minister has
Mr. Speaker, on the matter that was raised in the question, the JobKeeper program saved 700,000 jobs. 700,000 jobs. And, Mr. Speaker, they won't put it in the question that that's what they're referring to. They'll sneakily not mention that what they're referring to is the JobKeeper program that saved 700,000 jobs at a time, Mr. Speaker, when the Australian people were looking into the abyss of a pandemic nobody understood or had any idea about what would occur. This government stood up and we put JobKeeper in place. And the very next morning, when hundreds of thousands of Australians were going to lose their job and not know how they were going to put food on the table for their families, and businesses who had worked for decades to put their businesses in place were fearing that their businesses were going to fall over, this government stood up. This government stood up with the single largest income support program, does it a partnership between business, the government and the financial sector to save this country's economy, Mr. Speaker. Now, those opposite like to pretend to bipartisanship on many issues, Mr. Speaker. They like to pretend to it and they'll try to do it before this year's election. But what I know, Mr. Speaker, is they talk out both sides of their mouth. They say they support JobKeeper, but they come in here and they bag it, Mr. Speaker. They say they support us on national security, but then they speak out the other side of their mouth. You can't have an each-way bet on Australia's economy. You can't have an each-way bet on national security, Mr. Speaker. And there's no safety in anyone taking a one-way bet on this Leader of the Labor Party.
Nice try. The member for Ryan.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister please inform the House how the Morrison government's strong and certain record on defence and national security keeps Australia and Australians safe and secure, and is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for Ryan for his question and also acknowledge the great work that he does with his defence community, not just through Gallipoli Barracks, but for many of the not-for-profit organisations, the organisations that are helping veterans groups. He goes above and beyond to help those groups, and we really should acknowledge that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know that we live in an incredibly uncertain time and that uncertainty is only going to increase into the future. We're watching as circumstances unfold in the Ukraine at the moment and in the Indo-Pacific. We are very concerned about the build-up of nuclear weapons and the build-up of missiles, and we are worried about making sure that we can keep peace and security at the forefront in our own region. So, Mr Speaker, that's why we've invested a record amount in relation to defence. It's why we've increased spending by over 60%. It's why we've met and exceeded our commitment to raise defence spending above 2% of GDP. And, Mr Speaker, we are investing more than $270 billion in defence capability. We're acquiring the nuclear-powered submarines, and we're undertaking the most significant renewal of the Navy since the Second World War. And, Mr Speaker, that contrasts to that which we inherited when we came into government. Defence was a mess. Let's be very frank about it. The money that Labor had ripped out of defence meant that they had cancelled or cut or delayed over 160 projects. Mr Speaker, they hadn't ordered a submarine, they hadn't ordered a ship, they had, Mr Speaker, not invested properly into our people. They took money out of ASIO, which meant that our effort to counter foreign interference and to counter terrorism was put at risk, Mr Speaker. They took money out of the ACIC, they took money out of the Australian Federal Police, they took money out of the Australian Border Force because, Mr Speaker, they prioritised other issues above our national security. And so if you're asking yourself what would Labor look like if they won the next election when it comes to defence, don't look at what they're saying now. Don't look at the rhetoric that's being pumped out by the backroom bullies of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. Look, Mr Speaker, at what they did when they were in government. That is your best guide to understand what they would do if they were in government again. This Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, sat with, as the Deputy Prime Minister, with Mr Rudd and with Ms Gillard and made the decisions to cut spending to the bone when it came to defence. And the men and women of the Australian Defence Force were those who suffered most. But ultimately, Mr Speaker, Labor in charge of national security means that all Australians pay the price.
The minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the Deputy Opposition Leader.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. At the height of the bushfire crisis, Gladys Berejiklian said the Prime Minister was, quote, more concerned with politics than people. More than 700 people have died of COVID in aged care this year, but the Prime Minister hasn't spent this past fortnight focused on a desperate, untrue scare campaign. Wasn't Gladys Berejiklian right? Why won't the Prime Minister just do his job?
The Prime Minister has.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, the premise of the question put forward by the Deputy Leader of the Labor Party is false. The premise is false, Mr Speaker. But I'm asked about the job of the Prime Minister, Mr Speaker. I'm asked about that job. And on a day, Mr Speaker, when we can say in this country that youth unemployment is at 9%, that's my job, Mr Speaker, keeping Australians in jobs. And under this government and our economic policies, Mr Speaker, more than 1 million women are in work today that weren't in work under the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. Youth unemployment is at one of the lowest levels we've seen for more than a decade, Mr Speaker. Women's unemployment is at 4%. You've got to go back to the 70s, Mr Speaker, when they started doing records on those issues. That's my job, Mr Speaker, to get Australians into work, to ensure that they have the hope of a stronger future because they're living in a strong economy that's getting stronger as we come out of this pandemic. Mr Speaker, it's my job to keep Australians safe. It's my job to ensure that we continue to fund our defence forces and we put the laws in place that support our intelligence agencies to keep Australians safe. And it's my job, Mr Speaker, to stand up for the liberal democratic values that a country like Australia has always stood up for. And if there's any country out there, including our region, who thinks they can bully and coerce Australia, Mr Speaker, they won't find a preferred candidate in this Prime Minister, Mr Speaker. They might find one on the other side, and they certainly seem to have picked one, Mr Speaker, but they won't find one in this Prime Minister because under our government, Mr Speaker, we have stood up for Australian values. We have stood up to the bullies, Mr Speaker. We have stood up to those who would seek to coerce And, Mr Speaker, whether it's an agreement we formed with the United Kingdom and the United States, and I had the great pleasure to speak to Prime Minister Johnson this morning to ensure we're keeping the pedal down on proceeding with our AUKUS agreement, which is so important, Mr Speaker. Last Friday I sat with the Quad members that this government, Mr Speaker, has re-energised, working with the governments of India, with Japan and the United States. We have concluded the defence agreement, the reciprocal access agreement with Japan, Mr Speaker. These are the jobs of the Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, and you cannot be a weak reed, Mr Speaker, if you want to do that sort of a job. Mr Speaker, strength in this job is what this job is all about. The Leader of the Labor Party likes to think he's a small target, Mr Speaker. That's his plan. All he is small, Mr Speaker, and he's diminishing by the day. He is diminishing by the day, Mr Speaker. He comes in here and he tables essays from 1981.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On a point of order, you made a ruling under Standing Order 90, I think it was at the beginning of this week, which the comments from the Prime Minister just then directly flout.
I'm not going to ask anyone to repeat it, but if you want to repeat it. Look, if it's what I thought I heard over the noise, the practice does talk about the political sensitivities of members in this House. I think there is, if it is what I thought it was, I think there's a big difference between what I've previously picked the Treasurer up on and what was just said then. So I'll let it go through, but I'll listen very carefully to the Prime Minister. But it doesn't help, once again, when the noise is so loud. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This job is all about strength. This job is all about strength, Mr Speaker, and this is a very weak Leader of the Labor Party.
The call alternates, and the member for Rankin on a point of order, is it?
No, I've got a question.
On a question. The call alternates.
Yeah, he hadn't jumped.
The member for Braddon has the call. The member for Braddon.
Well, thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government continues to improve community safety and national security in a strong and certain way by tackling head-on the threat posed to Australia by serious organised crime? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches? Minister.
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And like everyone on this side of the House, he knows that the safety and security of our local communities relies on the strong approach that this government has taken on a whole range of issues. So strong borders, a strong stand against those who commit crimes, a tougher approach to sentencing. These are the things that Australians know that they can rely on a coalition government to deliver. Now, it's in stark contrast, Mr Speaker, to those opposite. And frankly, it's quite disturbing that they don't want us to be here talking about national security or community safety. Australians clearly want to feel safe and secure in their communities, and they want their government to be out there every single day doing everything that they can to ensure that they are safe and secure. But unfortunately, Mr Speaker, Labor seems to be very focused on being a small target, a teeny target. In fact, very focused on trying to slide in.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
It's relevance, Mr Speaker. We get 30 seconds, all we hear is the words strong and tough. There's actually no substantive answer to any question, and then we enter into a spray on the opposition. Mr Speaker, the question time is—
Microphone's off. The microphone is off. The Manager of Opposition Business was asked about alternative approaches. And look, it's probably a good opportunity to raise this. The Minister for Home Affairs was asked about alternative approaches. It's probably a good opportunity to touch on this issue, as I have done previously in relation to times. 3-minute questions, 3-minute answers are provided under the standing orders. There's no set ratio of how much a minister should. It's not very helpful, Minister for Defence. There's no set ratio as to how much time a minister needs to provide on certain aspects of a question. Having said that, I would remind ministers that there needs to be a reasonable attempt at looking at one's own government's policies, for example. So I would ask ministers to reflect on that, and the minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I think it's very fair for the Australian people to be able to have the opportunity to witness the very stark contrast between the government, the Morrison government, and those opposite who have been reasonably silent on a range of issues, but particularly on community safety and national security matters. Now, people in Australia will soon be making a choice. And on this side of the House, as their government, they have a government that has a very strong track record of being strong on national security matters. And particularly, I would go to our track record on border security. Now, earlier today, I indicated once again the track record that Labor, those opposite, have had, and the mess that we were left with to clean up on this side of the House. Now, we have done that, and we have demonstrated time and time again that on matters of border security, on matters of community safety, on matters of national security, the track record, the record of delivery sits with a coalition government. Now, Mr Speaker, we have had some significant legislation before the House this week, and I speak specifically about the legislation in relation to firearms and to trafficking. Now, it was very interesting, the positions that have been taken by Labor, and I do say positions quite deliberately, because we have had the opposition spokesperson saying earlier today that she hadn't read the legislation. She wasn't aware of it being introduced, but it was introduced yesterday. So it really is time for Labor to wake up.
Minister's time has expired, and I would just ask the member for Rankin not to approach the dispatch box before his time and before he's called. Thank the member for Rankin. Member for Rankin has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Treasury has revealed more than $3.3 million was spent on economic comeback ads, which had to be paused after the Prime Minister's failures on vaccines and quarantine locked down the economy last year. Shouldn't the government's priority have been actually securing the recovery instead of claiming credit for it prematurely with taxpayer-funded marketing and spin that had to be canned?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, I thank the Shadow Treasurer for his dixit, Mr Speaker, because it gives me the opportunity to talk about the economic recovery which is underway, Mr Speaker. And today, Mr Speaker, more than 13,000 jobs added, Mr Speaker, to the record of this economy, Mr Speaker. Oh, he can bellow all he likes, Mr Speaker, but what he knows is he put it to this government. The Shadow Treasurer put it to this government that the test of economic management of this government and the test of how we were managing this pandemic would be jobs, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat for one moment. Member for Rankin asked a question. I would have thought he'd want to hear the answer. He may not like to hear the answer, but he should hear the answer. The member for Rankin will keep his noise down, please. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And jobs has been our response to this pandemic, Mr Speaker. We have seen the labour force continue to grow. We have 1 million more women in work. We have the lowest rate of unemployment amongst women at 4% than, Mr Speaker, we've seen in a generation. We've got unemployment for those young Australians down to 9%, Mr Speaker. Jobs and jobs and jobs. That is the answer, Mr Speaker, to the question put by the Shadow Treasurer. He set the mark, Mr Speaker, and this government just didn't meet that mark, Mr Speaker. It exceeded. So if you like people getting into jobs, Mr Speaker, vote Liberal and vote National, because that is the challenge that the Leader of the Opposition and indeed the Shadow Treasurer has put to this government, that if this government can generate the jobs through the pandemic, then this government should be returned. And this is what exactly this government is doing. And, Mr Speaker, we have more trade apprentices in trade training today, 220,000 of them, Mr Speaker, than at any other time in economic history.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Rankin on a point of order.
Yeah, relevance, Mr Speaker. He's had a couple of minutes to refer to the $3.3 million he wasted on taxpayer-funded ads.
The member for Rankin will resume his seat. Yeah, I gathered that. The Prime Minister is relevant to the question. It was a very broad question, and the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I only regret there's not more opportunity for us to tell Australians about the strong economic recovery that's happening, Mr Speaker. We wouldn't be able to fill the airtime with the number of jobs that are being created in this Australian economy, because our plan to get us through the pandemic was about backing Australian small and medium-sized businesses, to back them through the pandemic with the JobKeeper record investment to support businesses through this pandemic, a JobKeeper program that this opposition, this Labor Party, said they support, but then they bag it at every opportunity, Mr Speaker, and Australians will know that it was this government who stood up for them in the course of the pandemic, and we now have one of the strongest advanced economies coming through this pandemic of any advanced economy in the world, Mr Speaker. On top of that, we have one of the lowest death rates from COVID of any country in the world, Mr Speaker, and one of the highest vaccination rates. So if I'm asked to say what the government has been able to achieve, a stronger economy, a stronger response to the pandemic with one of the lowest death rates in the world, and we are ranked #2 on pandemic preparedness, Mr Speaker, of all countries around the world. So, Mr Speaker, when it comes to how Australia has performed against the rest of the world in the pandemic, that is what we've delivered. And most importantly, Mr Speaker, we are getting Australians into work.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Moncrieff has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister update the House on the importance of the Morrison government ensuring we have adequate and certain dispatchable capacity to keep the lights on and power prices down? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Moncrieff for her question and her resolute focus on affordable, reliable energy for the households and 34,000 businesses in her electorate, Mr Speaker, and she knows that we need adequate dispatchable capacity, balancing the record levels of investment we're seeing in renewables, record levels of solar on people's roofs, with that dispatchable capacity from energy sources like hydro and gas, Mr Speaker. Balance is the key, and as old generators retire, they need to be replaced, Mr Speaker, with appropriate like-for-like generation. And that's why today we saw a disappointing decision from Origin, particularly for the workers in the Lake Macquarie region. But it also means that that focus on dispatchable generation is more important than ever, Mr Speaker. We'll work with the New South Wales government and the private sector to make sure that balance remains in the market and affordable, reliable energy is there. And we're already getting on, Mr Speaker. We're delivering the Hunter Valley Kurri project, Mr Speaker. We're delivering Snowy 2. We're supporting Tallawarra B in the Illawarra. We're supporting the Port Kembla gas generator, Mr Speaker. We're supporting all the major transmission projects across the national electricity market with $500 million of investment. We're supporting a new dispatchable capacity mechanism into the national electricity market, Mr Speaker, but I am asked about alternatives. We have a plan to deliver affordable, reliable power, and those are opposite don't, Mr Speaker. They are more interested in their own ideology than the interests of Australians, Mr Speaker. And when they were last in government, they teamed up with the Greens and they put in place a carbon tax and they doubled electricity prices, Mr Speaker. Well, we've seen in the last couple of years 8% reduction in household bills, 10% reduction in small business bills, 12% reduction in industry bills, Mr Speaker, while those opposite doubled it. The member for McMahon doesn't know the difference between a retail price and a wholesale price, Mr Speaker. And he's put his modelling out at the end of last year, and he assumed every coal-fired generator was going to stay on until their previously announced closure dates, Mr Speaker. Well, it's all bunkum. It's all bunkum from those opposite, Mr Speaker. There's no plan for dispatchable power. They opposed the Kurri Kurri generator and then backflipped and doubled the costs, Mr Speaker. They've opposed the $1 billion Grid Reliability Fund, Mr Speaker. They've planned to vote against the Underwriting New Generation program recommended by the ACCC, Mr Speaker, and we know they're prepared to team up with the Greens to make sure there are no new gas projects in this country, Mr Speaker. They are happy to keep people hot in summer and cold in winter. We'll get on with the focus on affordable, reliable energy for all Australians.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
On your watch.
Thanks very much, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Reserve Bank predicts real wages will continue to drop through to mid-2023. Doesn't this show that low wages are and have always been a deliberate design feature of the economic strategy of this almost decade-old government?
No, not yet, no. Prime Minister has the call.
No, it doesn't, Mr Speaker. What supports higher wages and higher real wages, Mr Speaker, is a strong economy. You want a stronger future, you need a strong economy. And, Mr Speaker, you're not going to get a stronger economy with the policies that have been supported by the Labor Party, and particularly this Leader of the Labor Party, over his entire political life. You're not going to get higher wages with higher taxes, Mr Speaker. You're not going to get higher wages, Mr Speaker, with militant unions running rampant.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business. Point of order.
First of all, Mr Speaker, the point of order, and it's on direct relevance. First of all, the question doesn't ask about alternatives. The question asks about government policy. The Prime Minister was able to talk about government policy for all of 19 seconds before he felt a need to talk about alternatives which aren't in the question.
Will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business is correct. There was no reference in the question to alternatives. The Prime Minister will return to the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I repeat what I said when I came to the dispatch box in direct response to the member's question, which is no, Mr Speaker, that is not what it means. So, Mr Speaker, I think I've addressed very clearly the member's question. And what I'm saying, Mr Speaker, is if you want higher wages in this country, you need a strong economy. You need strong businesses, Mr Speaker. You need a strong economy which has strong trading arrangements with the rest of the world, which we've been able to secure some 76.1% of our trade, Mr Speaker, supported by the strong trade policies that this government has been able to put in place. You get higher wages when you invest in the skills development of Australians, and we have record levels of trade apprentices and trade training, 220,000 of them, Mr Speaker, getting better skills, which means they can get better jobs and they can get better wages, Mr Speaker. And that's what we're investing in. Mr Speaker, you get a stronger economy when you invest $110 billion in building the infrastructure that Australia needs, Mr Speaker. The Leader of Opposition, he likes to talk a lot about his time as Transport Minister. He couldn't even build an airport that he said he wanted to build, Mr Speaker. He wants to buy an airline, but he didn't want to build an airport.
The Leader of the Opposition, quite a promotion, the Manager of Opposition Business. I appreciate that you've jumped up on, which is essentially one line of the Prime Minister on this point. The Prime Minister, I've asked the Prime Minister to remain relevant to the question. There are no issues in relation to, or no, there was nothing about alternatives in there. So the Prime Minister is able to comment about government policy, but if the Prime Minister can't go towards any opposition policies or any attacks on opposition policies. The Prime Minister has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So our strong policy of lower taxes, Mr. Speaker, cutting red tape for business, as we've sought to do, particularly with the EPBC Act, which has been stymied by those opposite, and we remain committed to that, Mr. Speaker. They are adding cost to every major investment in this country, and we are not doing that. We've been seeking to cut red tape for business which can actually drive greater investment in this country. We are invested in the skills. We have invested in the infrastructure. We have got the clear plan, a balanced plan, to ensure that we can deliver reliable, affordable energy, which has seen electricity prices fall by 8%. 8% over the last 2 years, 5% in the last year, Mr. Speaker. That compares to our 101% increase under the Labor Party when they were last in office, which shows that our policies, Mr. Speaker, are delivering the reliable, affordable energy that are necessary for businesses to be able to create jobs and get their costs down so they can actually support the labour force and the wages of workers with those higher skills. The Data and Digital Economy Plan, Mr. Speaker, which will see Australia be a top 10 data and digital economy by 2030. That was backed up by $1 billion investment by Google to put in place a research hub in Sydney, one of only, I think, 5 cities in the world backing our plan.
The Prime Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Resources and Water. Will the Minister provide an update on the strength of our resources sector under the management of the Morrison-Joyce government and what this means to regional communities like mine? Is the Minister aware of alternatives and uncertain policy approaches that may put local jobs in the regional communities at risk? Thank you.
The Minister for Resources and Water has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for Flynn for his question? The member for Flynn does a lot of Ks, Mr. Speaker, tens of thousands of kilometres every single year. He goes to places like Tieri, like Mowra, like Blackwater, like Rolleston, like Springsure, like Emerald. And all of those places know that it is the powerhouse of the Australian economy, the resources sector and agriculture, that provides them jobs and economic security. In an uncertain world, Mr. Speaker, that certainty is something which is valued by the Australian people and one which we support wholeheartedly. And for those individuals, Mr. Speaker, we know that there is a pipeline of projects out there, some $500 billion worth of investment in this country at various stages. It will deliver over 80,000 jobs. In fact, out in the member for Flynn's electorate, we know there are a number of projects. There's one at Comet Ridge near Comet, would you believe, Mr. Speaker, Springsure Creek at Walton near Bluff, North Surat and Taroom, which happens to be the home of Colin Boyce, the state member for Coward, another great supporter. And those jobs, Mr. Speaker, those jobs are incredibly important for the people of regional Australia. Now, in Queensland alone, it's 52,000 jobs and $85 billion worth of investment that is potentially at risk. It is potentially at risk because the uncertainty being provided by those opposite, in alliance with the Greens, is bad for this country's national investment risk. It is bad for this country's national economic strength. It is bad for this nation's jobs right into the future. We need to make sure that that gets nipped in the bud, Mr. Speaker. The people of Australia need to know what the risk is. Now, we've seen the member for Melbourne out again, Mr. Speaker, out on Sky News with Tom Connell this morning, and we know that he was part of and a signatory to the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard and Bob Brown's Labor-Green alliance in 2010. Now, how do we know that there is a risk in providing uncertainty? How do we know that this is likely to happen? Well, the member for Melbourne, and I quote, on that interview, "We're coming back now to finish the job. We're coming back now to finish the job." Well, I know what jobs they want to get rid of, Mr. Speaker. It is the jobs of the people in the resources sector. $500 billion worth of investment, 80,000 plus jobs. Labor, in alliance with the Greens, would destroy certainty of investment in this country. That is not in our national interest. At a time of significant insecurity, Mr. Speaker, right around the world, and uncertainty, we need the money that gets put forward by the Australian resources sector. We know they're on track to break all records, $379 billion. We know that they provide 300,000 direct jobs, particularly in regional Australia. And what do we see from those opposite, Mr. Speaker? We know that City Labor, in combination with the Leader of the Opposition, they're like a ping-pong ball in the surf. They're up, they're down, they're left, they're left, they keep going left. It's like they're caught in a riptide, Mr. Speaker. We want to see certainty for the resources sector. It is deals like those between the Greens and the Labor Party that will destroy the resources sector in this country. We want more jobs, not less. We want a stronger economy. That's in our national interest.
The minister's time has expired. I give the call to the member for Gorton.
Thank you very much, Speaker. And my question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister agree with Dennis Richardson, who John Howard trusted and appointed as Director-General of ASIO and Ambassador to the United States, who said today, and I quote, "The government is seeking to create the perception of a difference between it and the opposition on a critical national security issue that is China, seeking to create the perception of a difference where none in practice exists. That is not in the national interest. That only serves the interest of one country, and that is China."
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I do indeed respect Mr Richardson. I've spent a lot of time with Mr Richardson, but, Mr Speaker, this year the Australian people will face a choice, and we are facing one of the most uncertain times that we have ever faced since the Second World War. And Australians have to make a choice about who they think is strong enough to lead this country through these times. Now, Mr Speaker, I wish there was the level of bipartisanship on these issues. I wish there was. But, Mr Speaker, I will not set a low bar for that. Mr Speaker, our government is setting a high bar when it comes to national security. And that high bar means that you fund your defence forces, Mr Speaker. That high bar means you fund your intelligence agencies. That high bar, Mr Speaker, means that you put in place things like the Foreign Relations Bill, which means you could get rid of state governments signing up, Labor governments signing up to the BRI, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Victorian government signed up to the BRI. It took our bill to get the Labor Party off the BRI plan, Mr Speaker, in Victoria. So the pretence at bipartisanship on these issues by the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, doesn't measure up. It doesn't measure up. I wish it were true. I wish it were true that there was stronger bipartisanship, but for that to happen, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party have to lift their game on national security. They have to show the same strength and resolve that this government has faced and this government has shown in standing up to those who would seek to coerce us and bully us, not to have an each-way bet on it, Mr Speaker, to say one thing over here and one thing out of the other side of their mouth, but to have the resolve. But to have the steely resolve, Mr Speaker, to stare these sorts of things down and work with our allies and partners, whether it's to put together the AUKUS agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom, or to resuscitate and strengthen the Quad, and I thank our partners in India, the United States and Japan, or conclude the defence arrangements we've got with Japan, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party in government didn't meet these marks, Mr Speaker. They didn't meet these marks. They cut funding to defence. They cut funding to intelligence agencies. That doesn't help intelligence agencies when you cut their funding. Mr Speaker, in government they walked away from strong border protection. They don't measure up to the coalition, the Liberal and the Nationals, when it comes to national security. So, Mr Speaker, we have set a high bar. And this Leader of the Labor Party doesn't measure up when it comes on national security. And this Labor Party front bench doesn't measure up. And indeed, the member who asked the question, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Labor Party has entrusted him with defence of our nation if he's Prime Minister, and he couldn't even protect the borders when he was Immigration Minister, Mr Speaker. He let the boats roll in and the people die, Mr Speaker, and he was one of the most incompetent border protection ministers in government, and it was a strong field of failed ministers when they sat on these benches.
The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to table a letter from the Prime Minister to myself, 8th of October 2021, in which he said, "I thank you and your front bench for support of AUKUS and the government's decision to acquire nuclear-powered submarines." He went on to say, "Once again, I thank you for the bipartisan approach the opposition has taken in this vital national endeavour." Mr Speaker,
the Leader of the Opposition doesn't get an opportunity.
Until we got to the eve of an election.
His seat. Is leave granted? Is leave granted? Leave is granted. The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Employment, Workforce, Skills, Small and Family Business. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government's economic plan is supporting Australian small businesses and securing stability and certainty for the future? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Employment, Workforce, Skills, Small and Family Business has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Chisholm for her question and the outstanding way she represents and stands up for the 22,100 small businesses in her electorate. This month I accompanied the Prime Minister to the member's electorate and we went to Core Equipment and caught up with Core's Managing Director Steve and heard Steve talk about the impact that JobKeeper had, the boosting apprenticeship commencement had on his business. Steve spoke about the government's $2 billion investment in the Job Trainer program and how that's made such a difference that Steve is putting on 50 new staff in Core Equipment this year. 50. It's extraordinary, Mr Speaker. Steve's business is not just surviving because of the Morrison government's economic input, it is thriving. And that's what economic recovery looks like. That's what unemployment at 4.2% looks like. That's what the second highest participation rate in our nation's history looks like. That's what the highest participation rate of women looks like, and I know we all celebrate that achievement driven by the Morrison government's economic inputs. 3.5 million small and family businesses, Mr Speaker. They're 99%, we all know that, of businesses out there. And the Morrison government is delivering writ large for those businesses. Over 1.1 million Australian jobs created since the pandemic hit. There are 250,000 more Australians in work right now than pre-COVID, one of the only industrialised nations on earth to be able to have that. Our plan is working, Mr Speaker. It's extraordinary. It is moving us forward, and this is why the Reserve Bank predicts an unemployment with the 3 in front of it. And we're able to get there because of the financial supports the Morrison government has put in place during a 1-in-100-year pandemic. Over $314 billion in direct economic supports. Now, there's more to do. We're not there yet. Since 2013, this side of politics, the government, has put in over 370 small business measures. Extraordinary. Everything from tax deductions from 30% down to 25%, to the payment times reporting register so business can see exactly what the payment times of large businesses is. Now, there's always more to do. Now, I'm asked about alternative approaches, Mr Speaker, and unfortunately, this side has put in 370 measures for small business. Can anyone imagine how many measures for small business the opposition have announced leading into an election in less than 100 days? 0, nil, nilch, zip, nothing. Not a sausage, not a one, not a single statement on small business. That is what the Leader of the Opposition and his front bench thinks of the powerhouse of the economy.
The Minister's time has expired, and I give the call to the member for Brand.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister explain his 2017 trip to Beijing for the signing of an MOU where he said on 16 September that year, and I quote, "There is also agreement today on third-party cooperation about infrastructure and other investments as part of the One Belt, One Road program." Can the Prime Minister tell the House why his government has kept this MOU secret? Will the Prime Minister table the MOU today?
Just before I call the Prime Minister, I haven't called the Prime Minister yet because there's no point, because I wouldn't be able to hear what the Prime Minister is saying. Prime Minister, I haven't given you the call yet, Prime Minister. I'm waiting for the level of interjections. I'm so pleased the member for McEwen is right down the back there. The level of interjections is too high. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is a matter of public record that the government's policy, both under the previous Prime Minister and I, has been not to sign up to the Belt and Road Initiative. We have not signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. Never have, never will, Mr Speaker. where discrete projects have been pursued in particular parts of the world, which is the policy of those opposite, I note, Mr Speaker, then where there's been co-investment in projects, that has occurred. But, Mr Speaker, we have not, never will sign up to the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, Mr Speaker, I note that the reference is made to when I was last there in 2017, Mr Speaker, as part of the closer economic dialogue arrangements, Mr Speaker, that was between our governments. Now, Mr Speaker, those dialogues have not occurred for many years, Mr Speaker. They have not occurred for many years, and a lot has happened in the last 5 years, Mr Speaker. Since then, Australia has been subject to economic coercion by the Chinese government,
Members on
Mr.
my
Speaker,
left.
and we have stood up to that more
Member for
firmly
Brand.
than any other country, Mr Speaker, almost anywhere in the world. But we note the bravery and courage of Lithuania, Mr Speaker, and we stand with the Lithuanians on those issues. And we have worked with other countries around the world to stand up to the economic coercion of the Chinese government, which has only been met with more retaliation on Australia. Now, Mr Speaker, I am not the leader of a political party who was happy to trade away some coercion, Mr Speaker, for other coercion. That's the leader of the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. The leader of the Labor Party is the Chinese government's pick at this election.
Has the Prime Minister concluded? Was that a yes? Yes, the Prime Minister has concluded his answer. If the Prime Minister made an unparliamentary remark, did the Prime Minister make an unparliamentary remark? Just having reflected on that question, it's a bit late now, but it really did contain a level of argument. But anyway, we'll move on. We'll move on. That it was secret. We'll move on. The member for Robertson has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is also to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House why it is important in these uncertain times for governments to make decisions for our nation's future with certainty and with strength? And is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question, Mr Speaker. This country does face very uncertain times. We face a very uncertain international outlook. We face, even as we stand here today, the terrible situation that we see in Ukraine and Europe, Mr Speaker, where we have Russian troops still amassed on the border, where we still have the situation of cyber attacks being reported to be undertaken on Ukraine, Mr Speaker, on their government, on their military and on their banks, Mr Speaker. And we have the situation where the countries of the world that believe in liberal democracy and freedom and the sovereignty of nations and being free from coercion are standing together against Russia. But we do indeed have a situation where there is one very large country in our region, Mr Speaker, has not joined those countries in condemning that, and I can ask them to do so again. But we do live in very uncertain times, and that does flow through to the economy. And this year, Australian people will make a very important choice about the future. A strong economy, Mr Speaker, will deliver a stronger future for Australians. And that strong economy, Mr Speaker, will enable us to continue to support our defence forces, our sovereign manufacturing capability, and to ensure that we can keep downward pressure on inflation to deal with rising cost of living pressures. Mr Speaker, that strong economy and strong financial management will enable us to continue to see our economy push through and come out of this pandemic as one of the strongest economies in the world of advanced economies. Now, this is no accident. This is no accident, Mr Speaker. This is the product of a clear economic plan that has been taking this country through this pandemic. And, Mr Speaker, in the same vein, our strong plans on national security, whether it's on protecting our borders, bolstering our defence forces, funding our intelligence agencies, working with our partners to enter into landmark new agreements to keep Australians safe and stand up to the coercion we see in our region. These are the standards that we have set as a government, Mr Speaker, and Australians will have a choice between the strength of our government and the strength of our economic management and the strength of our leadership on keeping Australians safe, whether it's through the pandemic or, Mr Speaker, with one of the lowest death rates in the world, or keeping Australians safe in our region, Mr Speaker, or they have the choice of weakness of the Labor Party and their demonstrated weakness of the Labor Party, not just recently, but over the entire political life of the Leader of the Labor Party when it comes to economic management and national security. Mr Speaker, he spent little more than a heartbeat in the National Security Committee and the same on the Expenditure Review Committee.
The Prime Minister resume his seat. I have spoken to the Prime Minister about this, about references. I'm not going to repeat them, but I have spoken to the Prime Minister about that. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm asked about alternative approaches, and the alternative approach depends on the experience of those who are going to be delivering on those approaches. Mr Speaker, as a Prime Minister, I've delivered 3 budgets. As a Treasurer, I've delivered 3 budgets, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister's time has expired.
Just on the notice.